So welcome back everyone to part 2 of the Vermont Cyanobacteria Monitoring Training. We'll talk now about the visual assessment protocol that we use to monitor for cyanobacteria each summer. There are 3 categories in our assessment protocol. Category 1 is when little to no cyanobacteria is present. There are a lot of different ways that this manifests itself on our lakes, so we have several subcategories here. Category 1A means the water is clear. If you were to be standing along the shoreline, you could see all the rocks and pebbles in the water. You would see your feet if you went out and stood in the water up to your knees, say. If you're out on the open lake, if you were to put something in the water, in this case we show a Secchi disc, but maybe your oar or your anchor line, you'd have no problem seeing it. There would be very little interference, no specks and things floating in the water. So that's category 1A. Category 1B is also no cyanobacteria present, but the water is discolored. And this is due to sediments or other silts in the water. It gives it kind of a brownish tinge. Again, you can't see very far into the water, but it's not due to algal material or cyanobacteria. It's due to silt. And so we call that category 1B. Category 1C is a little bit of a catch-all category. It's pretty much all the other material that's out there. It might include pollen, like you see at the upper left. It might include filamentous green algae, like at the lower left. You might also have a mix. At certain times of the year, there's a lot of things that have been blowing into the water, and the wind and the waves will aggregate them into odd shapes and colors and clumps. This particular one is a mix of green algae, which gives the green color that you can see in certain places. It's also got pollen and cottonwood fluff as well. So it's just a mixture of all sorts of things. The other common thing that you'll see on the surface of water around the state of Vermont is duckweed. The upper image on the right shows duckweed close up. You can see individual leaves. If you were to turn them over, there would be little rootlets associated with them as well. But they can form streamers and layers, scums, if you will, on the water, like you can see in the image on the lower right. We do have a category 1D, which means there is some cyanobacteria present. If you were to look out over the lake, you would be able to see all the rocks and formations on the bottom, just like you would if there was clear water. But when you scoop it up in a jar, you can see that there is some particulate material present that is cyanobacteria. And so we have this category for that particular level of cyanobacteria. There's no health concern associated with exposure to this small amount of cyanobacteria. So it falls into category 1D, little to no cyanobacteria present. Category 2 is when cyanobacteria are at less than bloom levels. You're starting to see some small accumulations at the surface. The underlying water is still clear, as you can see in the middle photograph. The rocks and things are still pretty clear to see through the water column, even though that water is probably a foot or more deep. You might see lots of small particulates in the water, as in the photograph on the far right. So your enjoyment of the water is slightly affected here because our recommendation is to avoid contact with these kinds of accumulations of cyanobacteria. So we call that category 2. Category 3 is when a full-blown bloom is in progress. There's a lot of discolored water. The cyanobacteria layer is thick. It covers a large area as well. You can see these various images show lots of different colors and different manifestations of cyanobacteria. The color is influenced by the species of cyanobacteria that's present. It's also influenced by how much sun they've been exposed to. In the bottom left image, it was a very hot, calm day. The green and the blue that you see in the front of the image are actually the cyanobacteria that have been damaged and cooked, if you will, in that hot sunlight. So category 3, this is a situation where where risk of exposure is highest if toxins are present. And again, because you can't tell whether toxins are present, we recommend staying away and not coming in contact with water that is in this condition. If you report a category 2 or category 3, we would like to have some supporting documentation from you. We'd like you to take 3 photographs. The first should be a close-up, and it helps if you put a piece of paper or some way to identify your location and the date in that image. The second is a broad view of the water in that vicinity. We want to get a feel for how much of a cyanobacteria bloom there is, how far it extends away from you down the beach. And then finally, provide us with a close-up of water in the container. You'll take your sample in a jar and allow it to sit free for a few minutes. Again, that gives time for cyanobacteria to float to the surface and other things to sink to the bottom. And it gives us, again, a little bit closer close-up of the material to help us make the decision of whether or not we agree with your determination that you're seeing cyanobacteria. All of your photographs should be named very clearly. We're looking for the date, your name, and the location where you're taking it. Last year we recognized too late that many of our images were not named well, and the data and the images are stored separately at the end of the season, and so we weren't able to associate the image with the report. So we'd like to be able to do that in the future. So please make sure you label photographs, and again, when you have a category 2 or 3 report, we'll ask you to send in 3 photographs. So I do want to cover some unusual cyanobacteria that we observe periodically here in Vermont. The visual assessment protocol is based on the occurrence of planktonic cyanobacteria, so cyanobacteria that you see floating at the surface of the water. Typically those are green, bluish, or whitish, but occasionally we will see Gliotrichia, which has more of a yellowish olive brown color. The image that you see here on the left is a jar with Gliotrichia in it, taken at the same time as the photograph that you see in the center. It looks very similar to pollen. We see a lot of pollen in June here in Vermont. It has a yellowish kind of mustardy color, and it can form, as I showed in those earlier photographs, a really long skeins and windrows on the surface of our lakes and ponds. Gliotrichia does not bloom very often, but when we have had blooms, they've been later in the year, not at the same time that pollen is on the water, and not really the same color. The image on the right is a close-up photograph of Gliotrichia. If you were to collect it in the jar and look at it closely, sometimes you can see that it is very fuzzy looking. So it is also a planktonic form. It's common. We see it often in our lakes and ponds, but usually only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 colonies. Occasionally it does bloom. We occasionally also see surface accumulations of cyanobacteria that are more typically found growing on the bottom. This image on the right was taken at the Coast Guard boat ramp in Burlington last summer, and you can see in that circled area of the image some brownish reddish material accumulating at the surface. That is a benthic cyanobacteria. The image on the left shows you what it looks like when you look at it more closely. In contrast to the other planktonic forms that we talked about before, you can lift this cyanobacteria out of the water on a stick, and it will stay as a mat on the stick. It's not stringy like filamentous green algae, so it doesn't look like green hair, mermaid's hair, or some of the other common names that are given to filamentous green algae. It's not stringy at all. In fact, it breaks. If you were to take the mat in your 2 hands and pull it apart, it would pull apart a little bit and then it would break. These cyanobacteria also have the ability to move, so if you were to put a piece of this mat into your glass jar and leave it there for a little while, they would migrate away from the clump and toward the sunlight on the side of the glass of the jar. So you can actually see them moving out of this clumped material towards sunlight. So again, very unusual forms. On Lake Champlain, we've only seen this twice in the 5 years that we've had our visual monitoring protocol in effect. This is a close-up of that same cyanobacteria mat. You can see the image on the left is what the cells look like underneath the microscope. You can see that they're in small gelatinous tubes, and they break then where the tubes are clear. That's where they fragment and break apart. The clumps can be pretty good size. They can also be very cohesive. That lower right image is from that same mat, but the cyanobacteria filaments are so dense that is forming like a layer, almost like a piece of paper. Some of our inland lakes and ponds have other unusual forms of cyanobacteria. This is from Lake Maury. It's a genus known as Rivularia. It typically grows on the bottom attached to things. You can see in the middle image that there are a lot of these Rivularia colonies attached to this floating piece of plant material. They can be fairly large. At the time that this occurred, folks had been reporting colonies as big as chicken eggs or tennis balls. They're gelatinous but firm. They're often mistaken for egg masses, and they can be found floating on Lake Maury especially. They tend to release and float quite often. So again, just another unusual form to think about as you're out monitoring. And again, if you see anything unusual, please don't hesitate to send us lots of photographs. We can often arrange for a sample to be collected so that we can look at it under the microscope and confirm whether or not it is cyanobacteria. And with that, we'll stop part 2 and talk about how you get your data into the cyanobacteria tracker in part 3.